The sun bathed Lincoln Park in San Antonio, Texas, in a golden glow, its warm rays stretching across the manicured lawns and winding paths. The air was alive with the scent of freshly cut grass, mingling with the aroma of hot dogs and popcorn from a nearby vendor. It was the kind of day that made people forget their troubles, even if just for a little while. Children laughed as they darted across the playground, their joy echoing over the gentle gurgle of the park's central fountain. Parents strolled hand in hand, joggers moved steadily along the paths, and dogs barked in the distance, chasing, frisbees or tugging at leashes. Near the fountain, a man sat quietly on a wooden bench. His name was Terence, a tall, lean man in his early 50s with dark skin that seemed to glow under the sunlight. A pair of sunglasses shielded his unseeing eyes, and a white cane rested beside him, its handle worn smooth from years of use. By his side sat King, a retired German shepherd with a sleek coat and an air of quiet confidence. King wasn't just a companion, he was Terence's guide, his protector, and the reason Terence could navigate the world with such calm assurance. Terence and King were a familiar sight in the park. Regulars had seen them countless times. Terence walking with measured steps, King leading the way with unwavering focus. Some admired the duo from afar, while others stopped to chat, drawn in by Terence's warm smile and King's impeccable discipline. Today, however, most people left them in peace, absorbed in their own activities. But peace is fragile, and it doesn't take much to shatter it. The deep rumble of motorcycle engines broke the park's harmonious rhythm. The sound grew louder, drawing everyone's attention toward the parking lot. 6 bikers roared in, their chrome bikes gleaming under the sun. They dismounted with practiced swagger, their heavy boots striking the pavement with a thud. Clad in leather vests adorned with patches and slogans, they exuded an air of dominance. Their laughter was loud, their presence magnetic yet unsettling. As they strolled toward the central area of the park, conversations hushed. People instinctively moved out of their path, and even the dogs seemed to sense the shift. Some barked nervously, while others huddled closer to their owners. The leader of the group, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a grizzled beard and piercing eyes, scanned the park as if it were his personal domain. His gaze landed on Terence. The biker's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of the blind man and his dog. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like we've got ourselves a real hero here. A blind man and his mutt, holding court in the park." Terence remained calm, his face tilted toward the sun. King, sensing the tension, shifted slightly, his ears twitching. The biker stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "What's the matter, old man? Can't see me? Or are you just ignoring me?" A few people nearby exchanged uneasy glances, but no one intervened. The biker's friends chuckled, their laughter sharp and cutting. Terence adjusted his sunglasses and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "I may not see you, but I can hear you just fine, and so can my dog." The biker's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, we've got a comedian here," he said, turning to his friends. "Maybe we should teach him some manners." King let out a low growl, his body tense. Terence placed a reassuring hand on the dog's back. "Easy, King," he said softly. Then, addressing the biker, he added, "I don't want any trouble, I'm just here to enjoy the day like everyone else." The biker leaned in, his face inches from Terence's. "Well, maybe you shouldn't be here. Maybe people like you don't belong in places like this." The words hung in the air, heavy and ugly. A woman nearby gasped, and a man clenched his fists but stayed silent. Terence, however, remained unshaken. "People like me," he repeated, his voice steady. "You mean a black man or a blind man? Or just someone who doesn't fit into your idea of who belongs?" The biker's face flushed with anger. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, King stood up, his growl deepening. The biker took a step back, his bravado faltering. "Control your dog," he snapped. "King's just doing his job," Terence replied. "Protecting me from threats. And right now, you're sounding an awful lot like a threat." The tension in the air was palpable. The bikers' friends exchanged uneasy glances, and the park-goers watched in stunned silence. For a moment, it seemed like things might escalate. But then, the biker straightened up, his smirk returning. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Come on, boys, let's leave the hero and his mutt to their little kingdom." As the bikers walked away, the park slowly returned to its earlier rhythm. But the encounter left a mark, a reminder of the prejudice that still lingered beneath the surface. Terence sat quietly for a moment, his hand resting on King's back. "Good boy," he murmured. "You always know when to step up." The sun continued to shine, the laughter of children filled the air, and life in Lincoln Park went on. But for those who had witnessed the confrontation, the day would be remembered not for its warmth and beauty, but for the stark reminder of the challenges faced by people like Terence, challenges that went far beyond his blindness. The sun continued to shine over Lincoln Park, but the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter of children and the gentle hum of conversations were now overshadowed by the loud, abrasive presence of the bikers. Their leather vests gleamed under the sunlight, and their heavy boots crunched against the gravel as they moved closer to Terence and King. Terence, oblivious to the approaching group, remained seated on the bench, his hand resting gently on King's head. His face was tilted toward the sun, his expression serene, as if the world around him was at peace. But King, the retired German shepherd, was anything but calm. His ears twitched, and his sharp eyes tracked the bikers as they drew closer. Though his body was still, his presence was charged, like a coiled spring waiting for the right moment to release. The bikers came to a halt near the benches, their loud banter cutting through the park's once gentle atmosphere. A few park-goers glanced nervously in their direction before hurriedly looking away, pretending to focus on their conversations or phones. But even as people tried to ignore them, it was impossible to miss the tension that had settled over the area. The leader of the bikers, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a grizzled beard and piercing eyes, stood just a few feet from Terence. He turned to his friends and chuckled, nodding toward the man and his dog. "Check this out," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "A blind man and his mutt, holding court in the park. What's next? A one-legged juggler." His friends laughed, their voices loud and grating. Terence didn't react. His face remained turned toward the sun, his expression peaceful. But King's ears pinned back slightly, his gaze narrowing. He could sense the change, the brewing conflict that his owner couldn't see. And as the bikers' laughter echoed through the park, it was clear to anyone paying attention that trouble was coming, and it was heading straight for Terence and King. Terence had always been a man of quiet strength, a trait forged through years of challenges that would have broken most people. Losing his sight in his mid-30s after a devastating car accident had been a turning point in his life, but not one that defined it. Instead, it became the moment he chose to adapt, to persevere, and to live with purpose. Navigating a world built for sighted people wasn't easy. Terence had faced his share of obstacles, from simple inconveniences to blatant moments of discrimination. But through it all, he carried himself with dignity. He was the kind of person who turned heads, not because of his blindness, but because of the calm confidence he exuded. King, his guide dog, had become his anchor in this new chapter of life. A retired canine, King wasn't just a service animal, he was a partner in every sense of the word. The two of them had been paired 3 years ago, and their bond was immediate. King's training was exceptional, but it was his intuition that set him apart. He seemed to understand Terence's needs before they were spoken, a skill honed during his years on the force. King's previous life had been one of action and danger. As a police canine, he had been deployed on high-stakes missions, chasing down suspects, detecting narcotics and protecting his handlers. Those experiences had shaped him into a dog with a sharp mind and an unshakable sense of duty. When he retired, his transition to guide work had been seamless. For King, protecting Terence wasn't just a job, it was his purpose. The biker leader took a step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "What's the matter, old man?" he sneered. "Can't see me? Or are you just ignoring me?" Terence adjusted his sunglasses and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "I may not see you, but I can hear you just fine, and so can my dog." The biker's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, we've got a comedian here," he said, turning to his friends. "Maybe we should teach him some manners." King let out a low growl, his body tense. Terence placed a reassuring hand on the dog's back. "Easy, King," he said softly. Then, addressing the biker, he added, "I don't want any trouble. I'm just here to enjoy the day like everyone else." The biker leaned in, his face inches from Terence's. "Well, maybe you shouldn't be here. Maybe people like you don't belong in places like this." The words hung in the air, heavy and ugly. A woman nearby gasped, and a man clenched his fists, but stayed silent. Terence, however, remained unshaken. "People like me?" he repeated, his voice steady. "You mean a black man? Or a blind man? Or just someone who doesn't fit into your idea of who belongs?" The biker's face flushed with anger. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, King stood up, his growl deepening. The biker took a step back, his bravado faltering. "Control your dog," he snapped. "King's just doing his job," Terence replied, "protecting me from threats. And right now you're sounding an awful lot like a threat." The tension in the air was palpable. The biker's friends exchanged uneasy glances, and the park-goers watched in stunned silence. For a moment, it seemed like things might escalate. But then, the biker straightened up, his smirk returning. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Come on, boys. Let's leave the hero and his mutt to their little kingdom." As the bikers walked away, the park slowly returned to its earlier rhythm, but the encounter left a mark, a reminder of the prejudice that still lingered beneath the surface. Terence sat quietly, for a moment, his hand resting on King's back. "Good boy," he murmured. "You always know when to step up." The sun continued to shine. The laughter of children filled the air, and life in Lincoln Park went on. But for those who had witnessed the confrontation, the day would be remembered not for its warmth and beauty, but for the stark reminder of the challenges faced by people like Terence, challenges that went far beyond his blindness. On most days, Terence and King's presence in Lincoln Park was unremarkable. Regular visitors knew them by sight, often greeting them with a wave or a friendly hello. Children occasionally asked to pet King, their faces lighting up when Terence explained that King was a working dog and couldn't be distracted. Parents would smile, appreciating the lesson in respect and boundaries. It was a peaceful routine, one that Terence and King had grown accustomed to over the years. Today, however, the usual atmosphere of the park felt different. The arrival of the bikers had shifted the dynamic. Their loud voices and intimidating presence created a ripple of unease. Most park-goers kept their distance, hoping to avoid drawing attention. But Terence, seated on his bench with King at his side, was oblivious to the growing tension. His world was shaped by sound, touch, and intuition. While he couldn't see the bikers, he could sense the faint change in the park's rhythm. King, on the other hand, was fully aware. His keen eyes tracked the group as they moved closer, his body language subtle but deliberate. He didn't bark or growl. King was far too disciplined for that. But his posture shifted slightly, a silent signal that he was ready to act if needed. The dog's calm demeanor belied the razor-sharp instincts honed through years of training. The bikers, oblivious to King's history, saw only a man and his dog. To them, Terence appeared vulnerable, an easy target for mockery or worse. Their leader, a man who thrived on dominance, was already eyeing the pair with a smirk that promised trouble. You think he can even tell we're here? One of the bikers muttered, nudging his friend. They snickered, their voices just loud enough to carry. The leader turned his attention fully to Terence, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Nice day to sit and soak up the sun, huh, buddy? You and your little helper there, enjoying yourselves. Terence didn't respond immediately. He had grown accustomed to comments like these over the years, some born of curiosity, others of malice. He reached down and gently patted King's head, his fingers brushing over the dog's soft fur. We're doing just fine, he said finally, his tone calm but firm. The leader chuckled, clearly unimpressed. Fine, huh? You sure about that? Terence tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. As sure as I can be, he replied. The sun's warm, the air's fresh, and my dog's by my side. What more could a man ask for? The biker's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. What more? How about a pair of eyes for starters? Or are you just fine stumbling through life like this? A few of the bikers laughed, their voices sharp and mocking. Terence remained unfazed. He had heard worse before, and he knew how to handle himself. I may not have my sight, he said evenly, but I've got something better. I've got King. And between the two of us, we managed just fine. The leader's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. King, huh? That's a fancy name for a mutt. What's he going to do, bark me to death? King, sensing the rising tension, let out a low growl. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the bikers pause. Terence placed a reassuring hand on the dog's back. Easy, King, he murmured. Then, addressing the biker, he added, I'd be careful if I were you. King's not just any dog, he's got a history. The biker snorted. A history? What, like he used to be a circus dog or something? Terence shook his head. No. He used to be a police dog. Chased down criminals, detected narcotics, protected his handlers. He's retired now, but he hasn't forgotten his training. The biker's smirk wavered, and his friends exchanged uneasy glances, but the leader wasn't ready to back down. Yeah? Well, he's not on the force anymore, is he? So, what's he gonna do, huh? Terence leaned back on the bench, his expression calm. I guess you'll find out if you push him too far. For a moment, the biker seemed unsure. He glanced at King, who was now sitting upright, his sharp eyes locked on the man. The dog's presence was commanding, his body language radiating quiet authority. The biker took a step back, his bravado faltering. Whatever, he muttered, turning to his friends. Let's get out of here. This guy's not worth it. As the bikers walked away, the tension in the park began to dissipate. Terence sat, quietly for a moment, his hand resting on King's back. Good boy, he murmured. You always know when to step up. The sun continued to shine. The laughter of children filled the air, and life in Lincoln Park went on. But for those who had witnessed the confrontation, the day would be remembered not for its warmth and beauty, but for the stark reminder of the challenges faced by people like Terence, challenges that went far beyond his blindness. Tony took a step closer, the heavy thud of his boots drawing King's full attention. The dog's ears perked, and his gaze, locked on the man, unwavering. Terence tilted his head slightly, as if listening more closely to the man's movements. He couldn't see the threat, but he could feel it creeping closer. King's subtle shift in posture told him all he needed to know. But what neither the bikers nor the onlookers realized was that King wasn't just any dog. He was about to prove that even in retirement, his training and his loyalty were sharper than ever. The leader of the bikers, Tony, took another step forward, his shadow now looming over Terence and King. His boots scuffed against the gravel, a deliberate sound meant to draw attention. The other bikers hung back, chuckling amongst themselves, their laughter an unsettling backdrop to what was unfolding. Tony wasn't the type to back down from an audience. He thrived on it. King's eyes followed every movement, his body remaining still but charged with a quiet intensity. He didn't bark or growl. His training was far beyond that. Instead, he watched, calculating the distance, the angles, the possible threats. To anyone who knew dogs, it was clear that King wasn't afraid. He was waiting. Tony smirked, glancing at his friends before turning his attention back to Terence. "You know," he said, his voice laced with mockery, "I've seen a lot of tough dogs in my time, but this one here doesn't look so tough to me." Terence, still seated, tilted his head slightly toward Tony. His expression was calm, almost serene, as if he hadn't registered the hostility in the man's tone. But inside, he was listening carefully, piecing together the situation. He didn't need to see Tony to know the kind of man he was, the kind who picked fights to feel bigger, who mistook kindness for weakness. King shifted slightly, his body angling between Tony and Terence. The movement was subtle, but it spoke volumes. He wasn't just a guide dog in this moment. He was a protector, ready to defend his partner if the situation escalated. Tony noticed the shift and laughed, a sharp grating sound. "Oh, what's this? You think you're going to scare me, dog?" he sneered, leaning forward until his face was just inches from King's. "You're just a mutt. What are you going to do, bark me to death?" One of the bikers called out from behind, his voice half laughing, half worried. "Yo, Tony, maybe just leave it, man. He's just a blind guy and his dog. What's the point?" Tony ignored him, his focus entirely on King and Terence. "Nah, I want to see what this so-called tough dog's made of," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. He reached out, his hand hovering near King's face, as if daring the dog to react. King didn't move. His eyes remained locked on Tony, his body tense but controlled. Terence, sensing the tension, spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Tony chuckled, his hand still hovering. "Or what? You gonna sick your dog on me? Come on, old man, what's he gonna do?" Terence leaned back slightly, his expression unchanging. "You're right, he's not going to do anything unless you give him a reason to. But trust me, you don't want to find out what happens if you do." Tony's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Big talk for a guy who can't even see me," he said, his voice rising. "You think you're tough, huh? You and your little guard dog?" Terence didn't respond. Instead, he reached down and gently patted King's head, his fingers brushing over the dog's soft fur. "Easy, King," he murmured. "He's not worth it." King let out a low growl, the sound barely audible but enough to make Tony pause. The biker took a step back, his bravado faltering. For a moment, it seemed like he might back down. But then, his pride got the better of him. "You think you're so smart, huh?" he snapped, his voice tinged with anger. "You think you're better than me?" Terence shook his head. I don't think I'm better than anyone," he said quietly. "But I do know this. You're not as tough as you think you are, and neither are your friends." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Tony's face flushed with anger, and for a moment it seemed like he might lunge forward. But then King stood up, his body blocking Tony's path. The dog's presence was commanding, his sharp eyes locked on the biker. Tony hesitated, his bravado crumbling under the weight of King's silent authority. "Whatever," Tony muttered, taking another step back. "This isn't worth it." As the bikers walked away, the tension in the park began to dissipate. Terence sat quietly for a moment, his hand resting on King's back. "Good boy," he murmured. "You always know when to step up." The sun continued to shine. The laughter of children filled the air, and life in Lincoln Park went on. But for those who had witnessed the confrontation, the day would be remembered not for its warmth and beauty, but for the stark reminder of the challenges faced by people like Terence, challenges that went far beyond his blindness. Tony wasn't listening. His pride was on the line now, and he wasn't about to back down in front of his crew or the growing number of park-goers who had stopped to watch. He straightened, cracking his knuckles for dramatic effect. "Let's see if this mutt's got any bite to go with that stare," he sneered. Before anyone could react, Tony swung his boot forward, aiming a sharp kick at King's side. The blow connected, the sound of leather against fur echoing across the now silent park. King staggered, back a step, his body absorbing the impact. For a split second, there was no movement, no sound, just a tense electric stillness as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Then, like a switch flipping, King's demeanor changed. His body lowered slightly, muscles coiling, his eyes locking onto Tony with a precision that sent a chill through anyone watching. A low rumbling growl emanated from deep within his chest, not wild or uncontrolled, but deliberate and measured. It wasn't a warning, it was a promise. Terence's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "King, hold!" The German shepherd froze mid-motion, his growl fading into silence. His body remained tense, every fibre of his being ready to act. But he obeyed. His training was flawless, his loyalty unwavering. Tony, who had been smirking just seconds earlier, now looked visibly shaken. He stumbled back a step, his confidence faltering. What kind of dog is this?" he stammered, his voice trembling. Terence stood slowly, using his cane to steady himself. His face remained calm, but his voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "This isn't just any dog," he said, each word deliberate. "And you just made the biggest mistake of your life." The crowd watched in stunned silence, their attention fixed on the man and his dog. They knew, without a doubt, that something extraordinary was about to happen. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to feel in every breath. King stood still, his gaze locked on Tony, unflinching and unrelenting. The once rowdy park had gone silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Every eye was on the German shepherd, waiting to see what he would do next. Terence, his hand resting gently on King's head, spoke with a calm authority that seemed to carry through the park. "King, stay!" The dog didn't move, his body taut like a coiled spring, ready but restrained. To the untrained eye, he might have appeared calm, but those who understood dogs could see the immense control he was exercising. His growl had faded, replaced by a deep stillness that was somehow more unnerving. Tony stood a few feet away, his confidence visibly shaken. He glanced at his friends, who were no longer laughing. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with unease. One of them muttered, "Tony, let's just go, man. This isn't worth it." But Tony wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. He straightened, trying to regain his composure. "You think you're tough, huh?" he said, his voice wavering. "You and your dog? You're nothing. You hear me? Nothing." Terence didn't respond. Instead, he took a step forward, his cane tapping lightly against the ground. King moved with him, his body positioned protectively between Terence and Tony. The message was clear. If Tony took another step, he'd have to go through King first. Tony hesitated, his bravado crumbling under the weight of King's silent authority. He took another step back, his boots crunching against the gravel. "This isn't over," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "You hear me? This isn't over." Terence tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words. "It is for you," he said quietly. "Now leave." For a moment, it seemed like Tony might argue, but then he glanced at King, who hadn't moved an inch, his sharp eyes still locked on the biker. Tony swallowed hard, then turned on his heel and walked away, his friends trailing behind him. As the bikers disappeared into the distance, the tension in the park began to dissipate. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, let out a collective sigh of relief. Terence sat back down on the bench, his hand resting on King's back. "Good boy," he murmured. "You always know when to step up." King let out a soft whine, his tail wagging slightly. The dog's calm demeanor returned, as if nothing had happened. But the park-goers who had witnessed the confrontation knew better. They had seen the quiet strength of a man who refused to be intimidated and the unwavering loyalty of a dog who would do anything to protect him. The sun continued to shine, the laughter of children filled the air, and life in Lincoln Park went on. But for those who'd been there that day, the story of Terence and King would be remembered for years to come. A reminder that true strength isn't about size or sight, but about courage, dignity, and the bonds we share with those we love. Tony wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to play off his unease as casual indifference. "It's just a dog," he muttered, though his voice wavered slightly. "You're making a big deal out of nothing." Terence tilted his head, listening to Tony's words. His lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "You don't get it, do you?" he said softly. "This isn't just any dog. This is a trained canine. He spent years doing what you couldn't even dream of, protecting, serving, saving lives. And he's holding back right now because I told him to." Tony's face paled slightly as the weight of Terence's words began to sink in. "A canine? Like a police dog?" Terence nodded. "That's right. 3 years on the force. He's disarmed suspects, chased down criminals, and stood between his partner and danger more times than I can count. You think kicking him makes you tough? It just makes you lucky." The crowd murmured, their collective shock rippling outward. Many had suspected King was no ordinary guide dog, but hearing the truth from Terence's own mouth gave the situation a new gravity. People exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others glaring at Tony with open disdain. King, still poised and silent, didn't take his eyes off Tony. His training dictated that he wait for the next command, but his instincts told him to stay ready for anything. His tail was low, his ears slightly back. Not out of fear, but out of focus. Tony tried to muster some of his earlier bravado, but it came out hollow. "I didn't know, all right? I didn't know he was a special dog." Terence's expression hardened. "It shouldn't matter what kind of dog he is. You don't kick any animal, ever. And you certainly don't mock someone who relies on that animal for their independence." The murmurs grew louder, now a low rumble of agreement and judgment. One man in the crowd called out, "You're lucky that dog's better trained than you are, buddy." Tony's friends, who had been laughing and egging him on just moments earlier, now looked uneasy. One of them nudged Tony's arm. "Maybe we should just go, man. This isn't worth it." But before they could retreat, Terence spoke again, his voice cutting through the noise. "You think walking away fixes this?" He stepped forward, his cane tapping the ground with quiet precision. "You just taught everyone here exactly who you are, and you taught my dog something too, that there are still people out there who don't deserve the respect they demand." Tony looked around, his eyes darting from the crowd to King, who hadn't moved a muscle. The weight of the moment bore down on him, pressing into his chest like a physical force. And as he stood there, fumbling for a response, it became painfully clear to everyone watching that the power in this encounter didn't belong to Tony. It belonged to the man and his dog, the ones he had underestimated. Tony's bravado had crumbled, leaving him standing awkwardly in the center of a crowd that now regarded him with disdain. His friends shuffled uncomfortably, avoiding the piercing glares from the park-goers. The once laughing group of bikers was now silent, their smirks wiped clean by the weight of the situation. Terence took a deep breath, steadying himself as he straightened his posture. "You didn't know he was a canine," he repeated, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut. "You don't need to know a dog's history to treat it with respect." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Tony opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He glanced at King, who was still watching him with that unnerving, unblinking focus. The dog's calm demeanor was more intimidating than any bark or growl could have been. Finally, Tony took a step back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. All right, he muttered. "I get it. I'm sorry, okay?" Terence didn't respond immediately. He stood there, his hand resting on King's head, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long moment, he nodded. Good, now leave. Tony didn't need to be told twice. He turned on his heel and walked away, his friends trailing behind him. The crowd watched in silence as the bikers disappeared into the distance, their earlier swagger replaced by a hurried, almost sheepish pace. As the tension in the park began to dissipate, Terence sat back down on the bench, his hands still resting on King's back. "Good boy," he murmured. "You always know when to step up." King let out a soft whine, his tail wagging slightly. The dog's calm demeanor returned, as if nothing had happened. But the park-goers who had witnessed the confrontation knew better. They had seen the quiet strength of a man who refused to be intimidated and the unwavering loyalty of a dog who would do anything to protect him. The sun continued to shine. The laughter of children filled the air. And life in Lincoln Park went on. But for those who had been there that day, the story of Terence and King would be remembered for years to come. A reminder that true strength isn't about size or sight, but about courage, dignity, and the bonds we share with those we love. Tony opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. His words caught somewhere between an apology and an excuse. The crowd wasn't waiting for him to explain. Their collective judgment was written plainly on their faces, a silent but damning verdict. King, still sitting in his poised position, glanced up at Terence for just a moment, as if checking in for his next command. Terence gave the dog a small pat on the head, his hand steady, despite the tension still lingering in the air. "Good boy," he murmured, the praise a quiet reminder of the bond they shared. From the edge of the crowd, a woman spoke up, her voice firm. "You owe them both an apology, a real one." Tony looked around, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the eyes on him. His pride was a heavy chain, but even he couldn't ignore the moral reckoning staring him in the face. He shifted his weight awkwardly before finally mumbling, "I'm sorry." Terence tilted his head slightly, his sunglasses masking any visible reaction. "Not to me," he said simply. "To him." Tony's face flushed, his discomfort evident. He glanced at King, whose gaze remained steady and unyielding. "Sorry," Tony muttered, barely audible. "I didn't mean to, kick you." The apology was clumsy and forced, but the crowd's murmurs quieted slightly as the tension began to ease. Terence nodded, accepting the apology for what it was. "Next time, think before you act. It'll save you from situations like this and save others from unnecessary harm." Tony didn't respond. He simply stepped back, retreating to where his friends stood, their earlier bravado replaced with uneasy silence. One of them muttered something under his breath, and the group began shuffling toward their motorcycles. Heads hung low as the bikers made their way out of the park. A few people in the crowd clapped softly, an understated acknowledgement of Terence and King's quiet strength. A father holding his young daughter leaned down to whisper, "That's what real courage looks like." The little girl nodded solemnly, her wide eyes fixed on King Terence. Sensing the shift in the crowd's mood, exhaled deeply. He reached down and gave King another gentle pat. "Let's go, boy," he said softly. "I think we've had enough excitement for one day." King stood, his movements smooth and deliberate, and positioned himself at Terence's side. Together, they began to walk away from the fountain, the crowd parting respectfully to let them pass. The murmurs of the park-goers faded into the background, replaced by the familiar sounds of children laughing and birds chirping. As they walked, Terence couldn't help but reflect on the day's events. It wasn't the first time he'd faced ignorance or cruelty, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But moments like these, when people came together to stand up for what was right, gave him hope. Hope that, despite the challenges, the world was still filled with good people who understood the value of kindness and respect. King, ever the loyal companion, walked beside him, his presence a constant source of comfort and strength. Terence smiled to himself, his hand resting lightly on the dog's back. "You're a good boy, King," he said quietly. "The best." The sun continued to shine over Lincoln Park, casting long, warm rays across the manicured lawns and winding paths. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant sound of a vendor calling out to customers. It was the kind of day that reminded people why they came to the park, to enjoy the simple pleasures of life, to connect with others, and to find moments of peace. For Terence and King, it was just another day, but for those who had witnessed their quiet strength and unwavering dignity, it was a day they would never forget, a day that reminded them of the power of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. Terence gave King a gentle tug on the harness. "Come on, boy, let's go." But before they could leave, a young boy no older than 8 ran up to them with his mother following close behind. "Mister," the boy said shyly, "your dog's the coolest. Is he okay?" Terence smiled, his expression softening. "He's more than okay. He's my partner, and he knows how to handle people like that." The boy grinned, then glanced at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. "Can I pet him?" Terence chuckled lightly. "Not today, kiddo. King's still on duty, but thank you for asking." The boy nodded, his admiration shining in his eyes as he watched King walk beside Terence toward the park's exit. Around them, the murmurs of the crowd began to fade as people returned to their picnics, jogs, and conversations. But the memory of what they had witnessed lingered, a quiet reminder of the power of respect and restraint. As Terence and King disappeared down the winding path, the lesson they left behind wasn't just about a dog or a blind man. It was about standing firm in the face of disrespect and treating every being, human or animal, with the dignity they deserve. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the weight of what they had witnessed lingered. Parents exchanged quiet words with their children, using the moment as an opportunity to teach kindness and respect. Dog owners patted their own companions with newfound appreciation. It wasn't just the bikers who had been humbled, it was everyone. In one way or another, Terence could feel the energy in the park shift as he and King moved toward the exit. He didn't need to see the people to know they were watching, reflecting, perhaps even re-evaluating their own actions and assumptions. King walked steadily beside him, his posture proud but calm, as if he too understood the significance of what had just unfolded. At the edge of the park, a woman approached hesitantly, carrying a toddler on her hip. She looked at Terence with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said softly, "for standing up to them, for showing all of us what strength looks like." Terence smiled, his expression warm but humble. "It wasn't just me," he replied, resting a hand on King's head. "It's easy to stand tall when you've got someone like him by your side." The woman nodded, glancing at King. "He's incredible. You're both incredible." Terence chuckled lightly. "He's just doing what he's trained to do. But if today taught me anything, it's that we all have a role to play. Standing up for what's right isn't just about moments like this. It's about the small choices we make every day." The woman smiled, adjusting her hold on her toddler. "Well, you've definitely inspired me, and I think you've inspired a lot of people here today." As the woman walked away, Terence took a moment to pause, letting the warmth of the sun soak into his skin. He reached down to scratch behind King's ears, his voice soft but full of gratitude. "Good boy, King. You did good today." King leaned into the touch, his tail wagging slightly, a rare show of relaxation after such an intense encounter. Together, they resumed their walk, leaving the park behind, but carrying with them the quiet victory of a lesson well taught.